Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about Stormbringer versus Farseer, and more specifically, why Stormbringer is basically the default pick for pretty much everything. I've been getting a ton of comments about Farseer. Like a lot of them. Every time I post a video, regardless of the topic, there's at least 5 people asking why no one plays Farseer. And the short answer to that question is just Stormbringer is better. But admittedly, up to this point, I've never really explained it, I've just stated that fact. So for this video, I wanted to actually test both hero talents side by side and show the difference so you can make your own decisions. I ran Farseer and Stormbringer in 3 different scenarios: Raid Single Target, Mythic plus Single Target, and Mythic plus AoE, using the same gear and the exact same setups. So this isn't a trust me bro type of video, this is just a straight comparison to show why Stormbringer ends up being the preferred pick in nearly every scenario this season. But before we jump into the actual tests, I want to explain why Stormbringer has an advantage this season in the first place, because that really sets up the entire tone for everything you're about to see. With the current Apex talents, we get increased critical strike chance, increased crit damage, and more overloads, basically boiling down to bigger number, bigger damage. Both Stormbringer and Farseer benefit from this baseline scaling, but the biggest difference is where each of these hero talents' damage generally comes from. Farseer's entire gimmick is the grandmas and grandpas, or the ancestors. A large portion of that spec's damage comes from those ancestors duplicating your casts. The problem is that these ancestors themselves don't interact with the Apex talents in any way whatsoever. Your spells benefit, but nothing your ancestors do, which is a large portion of your overall damage, is affected by the Apex talents, which is an absolutely ridiculous oversight I'm amazed hasn't been addressed yet, but I've already talked about that. Stormbringer, on the other hand, gets massive value from these talents because its entire gimmick of Tempest directly benefits from all of them. So while both builds technically gain power from Apex talents, Stormbringer scales much harder from it because the core mechanic actually interacts with those bonuses, whereas Farseer's ancestors just don't. Basically, in Farseer, those Apex talents only affect about 50% of what we do, whereas in Stormbringer, they impact 100% of what we do. But with that context out of the way, let's look at the actual results. Now, all of these test scenarios were 3-minute windows of casting into dummies with the same gear, same setup, with the only actual difference being the talents. So starting with the Raid Single Target tests, I was actually a little surprised by how close this ended up being. In this test, Stormbringer ended up doing 13.23 million total damage, where Farseer ended at 13.07 million damage. That gap is obviously pretty small, being only roughly a 2% increase, and this was a clean single target environment where you would expect Stormbringer to be realistically much further ahead. But this does bring in some important RNG context here that's worth calling out. Over this 3-minute test for Stormbringer, I cast 17 total elemental blasts, and only 8 of them procced Tempest. That's actually on the lower end of expected procs, so this was a slightly unlucky or lower RNG roll for a Stormbringer pull. This also highlights a key difference between the two builds, being that Stormkeeper has much higher variance because a lot of its damage is tied to Tempest procs, whereas Farseer is much more consistent and doesn't rely on the same level of RNG. So the fact that Stormbringer still outperformed Farseer here with even below average Tempest procs actually kind of reinforces the gap between them. If this were an average or even a slightly above average Stormbringer pull, the difference would likely be noticeably larger. But either way, with this unlucky Stormbringer pull, we were still able to outperform Farseer by roughly 2%. And honestly, this might muddy the water showing you this comparison, but remember, this was only a single test done on each spec once over a 3-minute period of time, so RNG factor is very much a thing. I still wholly believe Stormbringer is the right option in all of these scenarios, but if you are trying to make Farseer work, or you want to make sure you're getting the most out of your Stormbringer spec, I can help you with that over on Patreon. And yes, that is a shameless plug, but you know what? It's YouTube, that's how it goes. Anyways, moving on to Mythic plus Single Target, this is where the gap starts to become a bit more noticeable. Just like with the previous test, this was done over the same 3-minute window, only this time I shifted into the Mythic plus spec for both to simulate Mythic plus end boss encounters rather than raid encounters. And in this test, Farseer ended at 11.13 million total damage, while Stormbringer came in at 12.87 million damage. This puts Stormbringer roughly 15% ahead, which is right around the ballpark of what sims are showing as well. And similarly, but also on the flip side to the Raid Single Target scenario, I was just as surprised at how large this gap ended up being. Based on how close the Raid Single Target test was, I expected this to land much closer, but instead Stormbringer pulls ahead in a pretty significant margin. And this also could go to reinforce my point about variance. Stormbringer has a much higher ceiling, but also much more pull-to-pull variability depending upon your Tempest procs. The raid test looked deceptively closer than it actually is, largely because Stormbringer rolled on the lower end of that variance. But in a more average scenario like this one, that gap becomes much more obvious. It's also worth mentioning that this Farseer setup is slightly compromised for single target. To make Farseer more viable in Mythic Plus AoE scenarios, you end up taking talents that don't necessarily fully optimize your single target damage. Stormbringer doesn't necessarily have this problem or have to make that same trade-off, so it keeps much more single target throughput while still performing well in AoE. But now let's move into the Mythic Plus AoE scenario, which is where the difference between the two hero talents becomes the most obvious. Just like the previous test, this was done over the same 3-minute period window, but this time in full AoE Mythic Plus scenario to simulate the repeated dungeon pulls. In this test, Stormbringer ended up dealing 46.55 million total damage, while Farseer came up at a much less 34.47 million total damage. And this is by far the largest gap we have seen, putting Stormbringer ahead by roughly 35%, which is absolutely bonkers. It's worth mentioning that a big part of this comes down to how each build scales effectively into AoE scenarios. Farseer is much more capped. Purging Flames only spreads to 6 targets, and Ancestor's Chain Lightnings are capped at 3, which limits how much value you actually get as pulls get larger. Stormbringer, on the other hand, does not have that same limitation. You're spamming Chain Lightning constantly, hitting more targets, generating more overloads, and feeding all that into more Tempest procs. And because Stormbringer is giving you consistent burst with instant Chain Lightning procs from your Stormkeeper charges and Tempests, you're able to ramp much faster on every pull. So as target count increases, Stormbringer keeps accelerating while Farseer starts running into those caps much earlier and falling behind. And even though I just spent all this time explaining target caps and all that good stuff, it's worth mentioning that this test was only done on a 5-target stacked cleave dummies, which is actually below Farseer's 6-target spread cap, and also below what Stormkeeper can realistically scale into. So even in a scenario that isn't fully stressing those caps yet, Stormbringer is already this far ahead, and if anything, with larger pulls, the difference between these two specs will likely be much greater. But yeah, that is all 3 different scenarios that I tested, and Stormbringer comes ahead across the board. It wins in Raid Single Target, it wins in Mythic Plus Single Target, and it wins by a massive margin in Mythic Plus AoE. Farseer is more consistent and a bit less reliant on procs, but it just doesn't scale with the current Apex talents, and it's running into target cap issues much earlier in AoE. Meanwhile, Stormbringer benefits from everything, and that scaling just adds up in every scenario. So if you're deciding between the two right now, Stormbringer is simply the better choice for pretty much all content this season. You can still play Farseer, but just be warned you're going to be dealing less damage significantly in nearly all scenarios that aren't Lightforged Paladins. If this helped answer your Farseer questions, make sure to like the video and let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe if you want more Elemental or general WoW content. I've also been streaming on Twitch every Tuesday, Thursday at 8 PM EST, so if you want to hang out, ask questions, or just watch keys or raid, feel free to stop by. And if you want to support the channel a little bit more directly, I've linked the Patreon down below where I offer coaching and additional content, along with a Discord link where you can talk about the spec, ask questions, or just hang out with the Elemental community. But yeah, that is all I got for this one, so thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.